Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to discuss the Rambam, Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh, the end of Perek Aleph, Halacha Ches. Ein mechashvin b'kevin chadashim u'ma'avrim shanim ela be'eretz Yisrael. That we do not calculate and establish every Rosh Chodesh or create a Shana Muberes, a leap year, adding on an extra month. You only can do it in Eretz Yisrael. Shenamar, because it says, Ki mitziyayin teitzei seira, udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. That Torah comes from Tziyayin, from the Eretz Yisrael, from Yerushalayim. That's where the Sanhedrin resided. And therefore, it has to come dafke from Eretz Yisrael. So the Mefarshim raised the question that the Rambam seems to contradict himself. Later on in Perek Daled, where the Rambam talks about the Ibr Shana, Perek Daled Halacha Yud Beis. So the Rambam says, "Ve'ein ma'avrim es hashana el be'eretz Yehuda, she'ashchina b'teicha, she'nemar l'shichnei sidrishu." That you can only make the year into a leap year, only in Eretz Yehuda, the section of Israel called Yehuda, because that's where the Shechina was, the Beis Hamikdash was there, and it says in the Torah, l'shichnei sidrishu, that you should seek things where l'shichnei, in the place where Hashem dwells, which is of course the Beis Hamikdash. So the question is, if we have the pasuk l'shichnei sidrishu, which is in Chumash Devarim, why would he bring a pasuk in Mitziyin Teisasera, which is from Tanakh, from Yeshaya? Be'emes, this question is not just on the Rambam, it's on the Gemara itself. And Tosfos asked the question. In the Masechta Brachos, Daf Samach Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara over there says that how do we know that you Mekadosh Chadashim, where do you do a Dafka in Eretz Yisrael? It brings the pasuk Mitziyin Teisasera, Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. And Tosfos in Sanhedrin asked the question. The Gemara in Sanhedrin brings it from the pasuk l'shichnei sidrishu of Vasa Shama. So which is it? Which pasuk do we learn that we have to do a dafka in Eretz Yisrael? And Tosfos doesn't give an answer. So whatever answer there is to Tosfos' question on the Gemaras, l'chayro could be an answer to the Rambam why he has to use two different psukim. So the Marsha in Kiddush Hachodesh in Brachos raises the question, and he answers it with a very simple distinction. The pasuk of l'shichnei sidrishu is talking about the times of the Beis Hamikdash. So we know from there, when there's a Beis Hamikdash, that's where you had to do the Ibr Shana. But what happens after the Churban Beis Hamikdash? It's no longer l'shichnei sidrishu. There's no longer the Shechina dwelling there. So therefore, we use the pasuk Mitziyin Teisasera, that the din of Kiddush Hachodesh, the dinim of Kiddush Hachodesh have to emerge from Tzion, from Eretz Yisrael. There it doesn't mention the Beis Hamikdash. Although the word Tzion could sometimes refer to the Beis Hamikdash, apparently the way the Marshal learns that it means generally Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it can even apply after the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash. The Tzlach, Rabbi Yehuda in his Pirush Tzlach and Brachos, gives his own original answer, based on another question that Mefarshim ask. How do we know from Ki Mitziyin Teisasera that you can be Mekadosh Chadashim? Ki Mitziyin Teisasera doesn't go on Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael. What about all the other mitzvahs? They apply all over. So why over here are we saying that this has to be dafka in Eretz Yisrael? That the pasuk teaches you it has to be dafka in Eretz Yisrael. Why is it different from any other mitzvah? And the Tzlach explains as follows. He says that when it comes to any other mitzvah, it's obvious that it applies all over the world, except for mitzvahs that are tluyis ba'aretz, mitzvahs that are connected to the earth itself. Those only apply in Eretz Yisrael. But any mitzvah that's chayvas haguf, the Gemara in Kedushin says that's an obligation on the person, they apply all over, not just in Eretz Yisrael. The pasuk says Ki Mitziyin Teisasera. It doesn't mean that Torah only applies in Eretz Yisrael. But when it comes to Kiddush Hachodesh, there's an anomaly there. It's an exception. It's the only mitzvah that even, the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, even Shegigin, even Mutayin, even Mazidin, even if the Bezdin deliberately distorts their psak and they declare Rosh Chodesh the wrong day, it becomes holy then. This is an anomaly. This is unusual. This is an unusual kayach that this mitzvah has, that the Sanhedrin has this power. So that's why the pasuk Mitzion Teitz Seder, that dafke Mitzion Teitz Seder, that applies over here. The dafke in Tzion has the kayach to empower the Sanhedrin to declare Rosh Chodesh, even if it isn't correct, even if it's done unintentionally the wrong day, or even if it's done intentionally. And then the tzlach goes to the next step, and he says as follows: that when do we say that the Bezdin has the kayach given to kayach from Eretz Yisrael to override the real Rosh Chodesh by declaring Rosh Chodesh on the wrong day, and that makes it holy, and the Yom Tovim are dependent on whenever they declare Rosh Chodesh. So we're observing Yom Tov based on a mistake or based on a deliberate distortion, because that's the kayach that was given to them from Eretz Yisrael. That only applies to Kiddush Hachodesh. It doesn't apply to Ibur Shana, because the Gemara talks about how if they made the leap year based on the wrong reasons, Einu Muberes, it's not a leap year. And Tosfos and Rosh Hashanah says that clearly, and the Rambam doesn't ever mention that their dinim of Ibur Shana applies even if they made a mistake. It doesn't. So there, you don't need the kayach of Kimitzion Teitz Seder. There, it's l'shichnei sidushu. That's based on the pasuk l'shichnei sidushu. It doesn't have. That's the pasuk in Chumash. That's the obvious pasuk. But for Kiddush Hachodesh, it's not enough l'shichnei sidushu. You need an extra kayach of Kimitzion Teitz Seder. What's taka the difference between Eretz Yisrael and any other place? There's a sefer called Eitzris HaRambam that collects Yanim of the Rambam for every Perik Le'iyun, based on the Rebbe's request that when we learn Rambam 3 parakim a day, we learn at least one halacha Le'iyun. So that sefer collected, and there's a few editions of that sefer. So he brings an Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer doesn't answer the question here, but he just says something to explain the kayach of the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael. He brings the Maharal, that when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael and they became mechuyev in Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lo Zeh, that all Yidden are responsible for one another, that was Ma'ached Klal Yisrael. That unified the entire Jewish people into one unit. The Rogatchover brings the Gemara, the Ein Tzibur B'chutz La'aretz. The concept of Tzibur, the real concept, doesn't apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's clear that the Yidden are responsible for one another any place in the world, but the real solid unity, the Chalais Shem, one nation, with a kayach of the entire nation together, that was given in Eretz Yisrael. And that's why in Eretz Yisrael, the Sanhedrin that's empowered to be Mekadosh Chadashim. He doesn't add this, even if they made a mistake, it's the power that they have. The truth of the matter is, he doesn't explain, the Avnei Nezer doesn't explain what's the kayach over here to change the status of Rosh Chodesh, even if they make a mistake. Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik explains the halacha, that the way the Rambam learns, especially in Sefer HaMitzvahs, that the power of Kiddush Hachodesh comes from the Sanhedrin. You need the Sanhedrin or their representatives. What is this kayach of the Sanhedrin? Because he has two very strong questions. Question number one, after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and after the time that the Sanhedrin was disbanded, the Sanhedrin went Eser Goliath until it ended up in Tveri, and then it was disbanded, and yet they continued to be Mekadosh the Chadashim up until the times of Abaye V'Rava. So the question is, with what kayach? They no longer had the Sanhedrin or the other Batei Dinim that were extensions of the Sanhedrin. That's one question. A second question, when the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, the beginning of Sanhedrin, lists all the tafkidim of the Sanhedrin, everything that you needed a Sanhedrin of Ayin Aleph, of 71 judges, It doesn't mention that they're involved in Kiddush Hachodesh. According to the Rambam doesn't agree with the Rambam, but according to the Rambam, why doesn't it mention there? And the Rambam himself in Hilchos Sanhedrin mentions all the functions of the Sanhedrin. It doesn't mention that Kiddush Hachodesh is one of their functions. So Rabbi Yoshe explains that there are two aspects of the Sanhedrin. There's a Sanhedrin that was the highest authority, the highest Bezdin, and they had the Kayach of Torah to paskin, and only they could paskin certain things. That's the list that's mentioned in the Mishnah. But the Kayach of the Sanhedrin to be Kiddush Hachodesh is not the Sanhedrin's Kayach. It's that the Sanhedrin represented the entire Klal Yisrael. And therefore they were empowered because they had the power of Klal Yisrael. We say in the davening on Yontif and Rosh Chodesh, Mekadosh Yisrael v'hazmanim, Mekadosh Yisrael v'Rosh Chodashim, that it's the Kedusha of the Yisrael, not of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin represented Klal Yisrael. And that's the power that gave the Sanhedrin the Kayach to even declare Rosh Chodesh on the wrong day, because the Kayach of Klal Yisrael is so powerful. And that's the Kayach of the Sanhedrin. And that explains why even after the Sanhedrin was no longer in operation, but the Rambam in his Hakdama to Mishnah Torah says that the Tanaim and Amarayim, until the times the Gemara was written, has the same Kayach of the Sanhedrin, because it's the collective authority. They represented all of Klal Yisrael. That changed when the Yidden were dispersed, and there's no unity, geographically speaking, of all the Yidden in one place, so there's no consensus. So every person has to go by the authorities of his region, of his locale. But as long as you had Chachmei Yisrael, even though they were not a Sanhedrin, they had the same function. They didn't have the function of the Sanhedrin for all the other halachas that you need a Sanhedrin. You can't make an Ir Anidachas or any of the other things that the Sanhedrin was needed for, because we don't have a Sanhedrin. But we do have the same concept of Sanhedrin vested in the authorities of the Yidden when they're all united together. So we now understand that the Gemara, with the Rambam and the Gemara, when it brings Kimitzi and Teitz Seira, that's the power of the Klal Yisrael that was vested in the Sanhedrin that was housed in the Beis Hamikdash, Mitzi and Teitz Seira. One could still ask a little question. The Rambam, when he talks about Mitzi and Teitz Seira, mentions not just Kiddush Hachodesh, he mentions also Me'avrim Shanim. According to the Tzlach, Me'avrim Shanim, you can learn out from L'Shichni Sidurshu, Enochanami, but doesn't take away from the fact that Kimitzi and Teitz Seira is the power not only for Ibra Shanim, it's even the power for Kiddush Hachodesh, even though they do it in error or even intentionally the wrong day. That power they get from Mitzi and Teitz Seira, and the mention of Ibra Shanim is only mentioned derech agav. It's not really the main point of Kimitzi, because that you know from L'Shichni Sidurshu.